the author of Essential Balances, which is a book I haven't read, but I have read his blog, which is a very interesting blog when it comes to the breadth and the insight that he has. So I would recommend that highly to you.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get started with Ivo, just as a sort of a general matter to get some context, Ivo, on how you got started with linked data and what your background is.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for inviting me. Well, my main interest has always been to understand how systems work. And by that, I mean three types of systems: individuals, organizations, and society. And I find that they have a lot in common, and that's in that book you mentioned. But also I see the use of knowledge graphs in these three scales: personal, enterprise, and global. My main focus, though, was always on organizations, and that did not change the last 25 years. On the surface, my professional path can be seen as an IT path, just with a bit of a strange slope. I mean, normally people in IT start as developers, then they become team leaders, at some point managers, and then they make startups. For me, it was rather the opposite. I started with startups. They were in software development and business consulting. One of them I managed until it grew to over 100 people. Then I continued as an independent management consultant and enterprise architect. And I started increasingly doing hands-on stuff. So what brought me to semantic technologies? Well, that was my interest in modeling organizational processes and structures. I was deep into enterprise modeling when I discovered OWL, and I developed my first ontology. Basically, I was dissatisfied with the lack of rigor of other modeling approaches. For me, it was strange to see that things like UML and later Archimate were away from the business, from one side, way too technical, but at the same time, not really executable. So how can you know that your model is right if you cannot run it? And further, what is the actual impact if the model is not used by the enterprise information system, but just to plan and document them? Then my interest shifted. It shifted into enterprise data integration, where I was puzzled by the way it was normally handled. And I can say I'm still puzzled.
Yes, a couple of things that the folks should note in your description of your background. Had a little bit of an echo here. One of them is that you have an interest in the whole panoply of knowledge graphs, and Peter Winstanley introduced our personal knowledge graph working group to you, because you've worked with networked note-taking tools such as Roam, and you've posted about that. You see how the commonality of those things, obviously, but can you just give us a brief description of your interest in the personal side of things? And we will be talking mostly about enterprise today, but yeah. It'd be good to just give a quick overview.
Well, my personal interest, it's very old, actually. It's from the 90s. It was triggered by the work, because at that time I had a company that was a partner of IBM, and we were doing things with Lotus Domino around knowledge management. So at that time there was something called IBM Knowledge Management Institute. I started following it. It triggered another interest that is still very big interest for me, in complexity and cognitive sciences. So I followed that, and at that time I was doing also lectures in knowledge management. And at some point I started thinking of how I handle my personal knowledge, which increased as interest when I was doing my PhD. So how I link all these things, but not only for the period of this project, but for the whole life. And then I found the system of Niklas Luhmann, Zettelkasten. I was and still am a big fan of Niklas Luhmann. There's a whole chapter in my book devoted on that. And I found his system ingenious, the Zettelkasten. Tried to imitate that first with a product called ZimWiki. Then I tried with something clumsier, but at the same time better in terms of functionality, which was the thing you know very well, Evernote, until I found ROM research. ROM research is still not a semantic knowledge graph, but it has the potential to be, because it's written in Clojure, you know, and it works with datums, and datums is like a triple, just it's a 5 tuple vector, so it has the whole potential to really add to what it has already, which is very strong explicit semantics that is currently lacking, and also persistent URIs. It has URIs, but they're not quite persistent throughout graphs. But it's not about ROM itself. It triggered a lot of a whole ecosystem of interesting tools like Logsec, Athens, Obsidian, Remnode, and many others that sort of try to find out different ways of dealing with this problem. And I'm very happy that this is happening because it triggers more innovation. For example, in the case of Rome, there are so many things happening outside Rome that are important for how it develops, that in fact, it's really a social phenomenon.
It is, and I know you've written a lot about community and autonomy in the context of an online environment, and it seems like there's the ability to harness the community in a somewhat different way than we're accustomed to. And you talked about centralization and decentralization in one of your posts. Any insights as to where the Rome trend is heading, or what are you anticipating next?
There are certain balances that's also in my book that are important for any system, individual, society, or organization. And one of them is the balance between autonomy and cohesion. If we look at where it was very successful, one such project is the World Wide Web. It is successful because the cohesion that is achieved through standards like HTML and protocols like HTTP does not limit, but on the contrary, it promotes the autonomy. People are autonomous to build things, to share things, and that triggers more and more innovation. It is a virtuous cycle, and actually it's a fractal of virtuous cycles. That's very important. In a way, I see this happening now with personal knowledge graph systems. And what they're currently lacking is the way they actually talk to each other. You can do great things in your knowledge graph, but at some point you would like to exchange things and to use certain shared parts of other knowledge graph as if they're part of your knowledge graph. And they're, for some reason, not yet there. I don't know why they do not reuse more from what was achieved by the semantic community. Really, none of them does so. On the other side, they excel at the way they handle text, but there are a lot of things now from the NLP community that they do not yet reuse. So I think these two potentials that are unleashed will shape the future of this ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got a nice perspective on sort of a high altitude perspective, if you will, on what seems to be happening. And often the tribes aren't talking to each other. And that's again the case in this context. Let's switch to the enterprise, and I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but I did want to get us some grounding on how you've worked with enterprises over the years. You're a really effective educator. You can. One of the problems that we've been having in our working group is, how do we? One of the missions is, how do we lower the barriers to entry for semantics and knowledge graphs? How do we make it easier for people to get started? You have taken steps to help educate people in terms of the semantic standards. What are you seeing in enterprise in terms of adoption and how to encourage it?
When it comes to semantics, that is related to that part of my life where I started working with European institutions. For example, with the European Commission, I've been working with since 2011. It was initially a consulting work on business process management and enterprise architecture. So basically, my first enterprise knowledge graph prototypes, they were under the umbrella of enterprise architecture. It was that also that I shared as an approach called SASE architecture, which stands for Semantic Architecture for Social Systems. And it was later when actually I was assigned something that was labeled linked data and semantic technology. It was around 5 years ago. So it's quite recent. What I found is that I first tried a top-down approach that failed basically. And then I started to do things differently. What I started to do is first a different kind of training. So I developed a training course that was a 2-day intensive course on linked data semantic technologies, but designed in a way that was with no prerequisites. And it was offered to all European institutions. So people came from European Commission, Parliament, Court of Justice, everywhere. And it went for several years. It's still going on once a month. What I achieved there is that over 60% of people were business people. I tried to make it accessible to them. Also showing that the mainstream computational paradigms, they require somehow that there is a translators of the business things to the IT. While in this paradigm, you can bring business people directly, that they describe their work, and this work is already used in IT systems. So that's a completely different way of looking at this gap between business and IT that brought so many things to happen, like business process management, service-oriented architecture, and enterprise architecture. They came in a very strange way. So if IT and business, they talk in different languages, all these bridges, they came providing a third language, which was not the right way to go, basically. And I tried to convey this message, to be gentle and warm to business people. I don't know if you know, for example, the way I recently described Sparkle with this metaphor for buckets and bowls, because people don't want to know what I can share it if you. People don't want to know what a variable is. They want to understand. They want to feel good about it. They want to understand how things are done. And they want to be able to do stuff, not to feel intimidated by IT people. And it's very important to give them this power, to enable them.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do. But
yeah.
I found something very interesting. So there were quite a few successful linked data projects that I did in the last few years. And I was wondering, are there any patterns that they show? And recently I found very interesting patterns. So the two most successful projects last year, both of them were pilots that were accepted against all resistance, and they now go in production. They have something in common, which is that they are not initiated neither by the IT departments of these organizations, nor by the core business the problems of which they solve. In one of the cases, it was initiated and led by a department for strategic planning. And in the other case, it was a communication department that had a knowledge management unit, mainly responsible for collaboration. And they developed interest in semantic technologies and linked data. And they triggered something against the resistance, not only of the business people, but their own IT department. And I thought, well, maybe that's a correlation. That's not necessarily something happening. I'm imagining it. This is my project. And I then checked this for a few other projects in the last 5 years in these big organizations. They're really big, like European Commission, 35,000 people. And in fact, it seems that almost always the case. It's not the core business unit that it starts things. It's not the IT. It's somebody else. I found only one exception.
Really?
Yeah.
So, what's your impression of the status of these organizations generally when it comes to trying to take advantage of this technology in a practical realm? Are they making progress with projects? Are they, because it seems like there has been a lot of investment over the decade. Where do we stand in terms of the European large public sector organizations? I know it's a broad question.
Things are not good at all. What I can say is that the lobbies of big IT giants are very strong, and there is one common thing for all public organizations. They tend to attract risk-adverse people. And this kind of path needs to be brave, to take risks, to take responsibility. What generally is happening is that responsibility is outsourced to two main players, either big research companies, market research companies like Gartner, Forrester, and so on, or big IT companies. Because if you invite somebody to solve a problem and you ask them, have you solved it somewhere else? And they bring you a beautiful list of several hundred references of success stories, there is nothing you can say. They were so successful. And then they ask me, I show them something, a nice prototype that can be done almost for free. And then when I ask, well, was this implemented somewhere else in this way? Can you show us? Can you really convince us? And when I hesitate, they say, well, we are not your guinea pigs. And in that sense, it's extremely difficult. One area where it has been progressing relatively well is the linked open data, because there are a lot of regulations and communications about interoperability. So this is sort of supporting such initiatives. But unfortunately, those that publish linked open data, they do not use linked data themselves. So for them, linked data is a cost. So I think that things will be different if the system they use daily are based on these technologies, because they will both gain and suffer from them and will make different decisions. That is currently not the case. Yeah, so it's difficult, and we are in the beginning, which is strange, because in terms of investment, if you see EU millions and millions put into research on these technologies, it's amazing, and not much of that is used back.
Yeah, when you're talking, it resonates with me because I was in Navy intelligence, and then on the civilian side, I was overseeing research contracts at Stanford, and what I observed inside the agencies I was a part of is exactly what you described. There's a tendency to contract with the big incumbents, and the fear that goes with trying to use alternatives, and there's a lot of myopia in what's chosen, and just a lot of inertia in what ends up being used. And so it's a continuing problem, not only in the European theater, obviously. We're almost to the hour, and Mark, you've got a question. Let's just open up the floor generally.
Yeah, question I have is that you mentioned the fact that, you looked at this organization and it seemed like the innovation rarely came from the core business itself, which kind of makes sense because if you're the core business, you're so focused on what you're doing that risk-taking isn't real high because you have to deliver. But the recipients of your work aren't under that pressure. And so they're a little more free to say, yeah, but this isn't really matching what we need. All right, so I'm kind of summarizing what you said, and you're nodding, so I think I probably nailed it there. The question I have is, how do you approach finding the right recipients into which you can start to insert this kind of technology and innovation in order to be able to leverage the big rock off of its stationary mount and get it moving again? How do you approach that?
That's a very good question. I think maybe one of the differences in my approach is that I really see the whole thing as a very complex system. I don't see it as an IT problem. I see everything there as equally important. Politics, emotions, agendas, history, context, all that, it's just boiling all the time and changing all the time. So I make sure that I follow it. And what is find as a successful way of navigating through it, just finding way to have a lot of small safe to fail experiments until you adapt the whole strategy, and trying to do that at different speeds. You have certain things that you deliver fast, certain things that you prepare for the next month, certain things that you really focus for the next years, where you need to have different talks with different kind of people that have different perspective. And all that should happen in parallel. Because one of the things that is common for change projects is that they are seen as projects. While we are talking about things that are not projects, on the contrary, projects are by definition myopic. They can achieve local optima at the expense of the enterprise, space-wise and time-wise. They could be something very spectacular that they will collect huge debt, and then when it was actually repaid, this debt, it was forgotten that decision was made a few years back. So all these things, all the waste that happened is very quickly forgotten, and the things that are spent only to compensate that are seen as something new, while it could have been saved completely.
So would it be safe to say that if you looked across the landscape and surveyed to see who incurs the most technical debt, political debt, whatever kind of debt you want to be looking at, from the decisions that was made by the core business unit, would that maybe be a way to elevate those participants in the ecosystem as ones that would be most receptive to finding a solution because they're carrying most of the debt, the largest part of the debt? That seemed like a reasonable approach.
It is difficult for me to generalize and come to any kind of recipes on that. I believe that different people, they do their best from what they know, from their position, from their background, from their perspective, from their mindset, and it happens whatever happens. So there are commonalities, there are differences, and it's very difficult to come up with something as a best practice.
Well, it sounds just riffing on what Mark was talking about, Ivo, it seems like there's another set of metrics that could be developed that just have to do with the long-term repercussions of what you adopt. And if you're just adopting something that's saddling you with complexity, which is what Dave talks about a lot in Software Wasteland, can you measure that complexity and even staff up to empower those who are measuring the complexity to say, hey, we're going in the wrong direction. We need to reduce complexity, not add to it.
Complexity is not always seen as as bad thing. It is labeled as bad thing, but action-wise is not only seen as bad thing in big organizations. Big organizations, I mean those that always have huge administrations like telcos, banks, and public sector. Because in fact, in many cases, these are problems that require solution, and the solution requires certain kind of spending, such a kind of new structure that you may be now in not a very good position, but you may start leading it, and that would be a good part of your career. So I'm not sure that there is a genuine interest to, and I'm talking about things are complex anyway. I'm talking about this self-induced complexity that is wasteful. Otherwise, it's also a complex that is a property lesson. That's not a problem to solve. That is something to understand and work with. But of course, we are talking now about this wasteful complexity that is self-induced, doesn't serve any purpose, and is just completely artificial based on chain of bad decisions.
Other questions for Ivo?
Peter's got his hand up.
I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
For quite some time.
Hi, Ivo. That was a really interesting set of points that you were making. I sometimes feel that we shoot ourselves in the foot with the vocabulary that we use. So many times people like Dave and I are thought of as being cancer specialists, you know, and
oncologists, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And the other thing is that when we talk about graphs, everybody thinks of, you know, an X and a Y axis and a line. Now, do you think that, you know, is there anything from your experience that would help us with getting the vocabulary right to get these sorts of things across better?
I would again here suggest a balanced approach. From one side, there was a lot of, I would say, negative influence from the research and academia, keeping the whole area being perceived as something academic, something not pragmatic, something away from the actual problems of IT. And in that sense, something pure with very specific vocabulary that only certain people can talk. So it's some kind of a bubble. On the other side, there is a few. There are quite a few attempts to simplify it in a way to bring people that are used to mainstream language with it, and I see it in quite a few very nice software packages like predicates appearing with the label of attributes. And I think that is not necessarily the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to simplify, but it's important to simplify towards a different direction, not imitating something that would require different kind of mapping. People need to map things with what they know. For example, in my courses, sometimes it was very funny. So people are sort of relatively comfortable with some parts of the ontology development, but most business people find, for example, things like Shackle and Sparkle quite challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very interesting to see people with 20 years in IT. Sometimes they did the exercises just as quick or slower than business people, because it was difficult to learn SQL when writing Sparkle. That gave me a lot of pleasure to see people that knew only, you know, Word and browser to write Sparkle queries faster than SQL people.
Yeah, and along those lines, it seems like I was listening to the radio the other day in the car, and a national public radio, and they one of the reporters who was being interviewed was talking about Slack, and his observation was that Slack is a nice solution to the wrong problem, and so you're because it's just creating more and more AdHocracy. And you've worked with process a lot in these institutions. What's the path we need to go down to avoid this AdHocracy and sort of give us enough structure to actually get things done?
Yeah, can you explain a bit more about this AdHocracy to give more examples? I'm using Slack, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
There's a chaotic, a sort of a random nature to the threads in Slack. There's and email as well. So we're buried in email, now we're buried in Slack. Can't possibly turn enough attention to just filtering all that stuff to actually get some actionable indicators of what to work on and who to work with, et cetera. And so you have this business process management heritage and very highly structured, rigid, let's say, environments, and then you have what I'd call the AdHocracy, which is the more chaotic and less helpful side of things. It surfaces discussions and you've got all sorts of threads possible, but what do you how do you make use of it? How do you make use of an email thread in a direct way? How do you avoid getting lost in the morass of stuff that you don't really need to pay attention to? Just information overload, in other words.
Yeah,
there's a lack of discipline that's involved in AdHocracy. That word is now part of my vocabulary. Thank you. I like it. It seems that that's what it is that if there's no discipline involved, which there isn't in social media, email, Slack, social media all have the same characteristic that anybody can toss anything in anytime they feel like. Whereas a more rigorous approach, a more formal approach that's not so ad hoc, gives you more structured capability to review what's there. It's the same difference between a knowledge graph using semantic technology and a labeled property graph, is that you identify a structure and context with the ontology, and you don't have that formality in the property graph. It's not to say either one is better or worse than the other, but these are different characteristics that carry them forward. So I think it's an excellent point. The AdHocracy makes it difficult to extract rigor and focus out of it. So I didn't mean to interrupt the response, Ivo. That was kind of a clarifying point.
No, that was a very nice perspective. My view on that is sort of evolutionary. These things adapt like just any ecosystem. It would not allow vacuum. And in many cases in the evolution, there are different kind of adaptation. One of them is exaptation, when something evolved with one function and it exapted to serve another function, not completely well, but quite fast compared to all the mutation that they needed to develop a completely new organ to follow that function. That is for the feathers and for many others. And I think this is happening everywhere. Just to one example, if you're talking about business process management, it was quite nice for structured processes, but it completely failed for ad hoc discrete processes. And then other things appeared too. Then it started to do certain things around system integration, but not quite well. And things like RPA appeared that are not the most beautiful species, but it's sort of,
Exactly. RPA, people latched onto it because it seemed simple and the departments could use it in sort of an Excel macro fashion to try to make themselves more efficient, but it just seems, and Dave calls it a Band-Aid. I agree with that assessment. It's not really solving the deeper problems here.
Yeah.
Other questions for Ivo? We've got 20 minutes left. Sebastian, you've had exposure to some of these things in your career as well. I'm just wondering if you had any comments or observations that are relevant here.
Hi, Alan. Thank you.
Hi.
So thanks for putting the word AdHocracy to my vocabulary. Anyway, I was struggling a long time with the linked open data portal at the EU. It was pretty complicated to get, to the data and everything. And thanks, Ivo, for sharing the insight. I think it fits to the picture that people are not leveraging linked data on a productive level themselves, but they see it as a publishing and as a cost factor. And I think that's something that reflects in the publishing platform of the EU. I mean, has come a long way. But yeah, I was struggling with that quite a lot. Like, how do you get the ontologies that are actually have been made there? I see that there's a lot of data sets here, but it's really hard to get to the interesting stuff. So maybe Ivo, you have some comments or suggestions on this.
Well, that's a very good topic, and I can talk a lot about it. But I can say only one thing that there was a lot of emphasis on metadata. So you can find huge amount of data sets described with DCAT, and you stop there.
Yes,
I mean it's like you enter a wine shop and you are allowed to see the labels, but you cannot drink anything. So this kind of approach could not really make things being valued, being used, being demanded, and being improved. So that is something which, but the same organization from the institutions is publishing something else, which is the whole European legislation as linked data, and that is extremely useful.
Wow.
You can find everything on any language. It's a very successful thing, which is now growing because they would like to increase the granularity to go to the lower and lower level inside the documents that would give to this level also their URIs and link them with other things. So that part is, I think, a successful case, not so much advertised as the other that you mentioned, but for me, it's much more valuable.
Could you possibly share a link to that?
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be super useful. It's good to know where the success stories are.
Yeah.
But whilst you're looking, Ivo, I mean, there are a number of countries within the EU that are beginning to get their legislative assets into order. I mean, for quite a long time, the legislation.gov.uk has had linked data IRIs for every part and every variation of legislation, but it's a bit slow to get up to date. And that's only slowly kind of improving. But Switzerland are getting together IRIs for the legislation. Luxembourg, the Grand Duché, has been doing similar sorts of things for quite a time. What I feel is missing is that, and I'd be interested in your kind of views on this, is that people are coming to these sort of things very late in life, and yet we learn about the information model of RDF when we're about 5, 6, or 7, something like that, where we have to parse sentences, the cat sat on the mat, we understand subject, predicate, object, and then we have this gap of maybe about 15 to 20 years before we then start to meet it again in RDF form. And I'm wondering if this is 15 to 20 years of huge missed opportunity, and that what we should be addressing is kind of like the 10-year-old. And that, I think, now has got a lot of really good material for them to begin to start using, both from Wikidata, from DBpedia, and from things like the legislation stuff, such that they can bring that into their schoolwork throughout high school.
I'm working with a lot of, with a few, not a lot, but a few people that are quite into machine learning and NLP, doing impressive stuff with transformers, and I see things that are quite difficult to do with RDF. I believe to really trust more, there are a lot of, because when you translate things into RDF, they look a bit too formal, too clumsy. So, and that's why all this tendency to use it only for metadata management. So once we find a way to bring these two worlds together, these new approaches of working with natural text and finding affiliations in different ways, which, by the way, worked very nice with graphs, but most developers prefer LPGs for them because it's much more easier to do analytics there, to create all these weights that are needed and so on. I think then it will be better for people, because they would not really care so much about these things. They would just naturally use them. They would appreciate how nice it is for entities and entity types to have a persistent URI and to be linked with things that also have persistent URIs, but also they need to find a way that these things are discoverable and emergent from new texts and from things that people naturally create. You would not start writing your message, your email in RDF. You just type it in your natural language, and that should be not just a matter you do it and there are easy way to annotate it. That's not enough. We need much more innovation in this area to make it natural, to make it, because now there are huge opportunities that these people using LPGs for machine learning are missing out because of not using RDF, and also I see the opposite.
Yeah, it's the tribalism that we talked about before, and when the linked open data community or the semantics community makes a suggestion or tries to incentivize good behavior, it's the tail wagging the dog. We just don't have a critical mass of influence to really have an impact on the larger developer community, for example, and certainly the business analysts who are likely to need what we have and need to learn how to use it. Other questions while in the time remaining? This has been a really good discussion.
Yeah, so I was very intrigued by your 2-day training, mostly aimed at business people. Is there an agenda or any kind of materials that you can have a look? I mean, I want to emulate that.
Because they were developed in the contract with the European Commission, they are intellectual property of the European Commission. Although I'm the author, I was paid to develop that to be provided inside the institutions. So I need to check how I can share it. Yeah, it's not something very special, but still it's sort of,
Yeah, I understand.
Anyway, it's I'm so heavily recommending your 2 books that everybody thinks I'm your agent.
I have the same feeling. Yeah, it really has been illuminating for people to read those books.
It makes a great Father's Day gift.
Other things we should be talking about, Ivo. What haven't we asked about that we should be?
I don't know. It's what I can say that the data-centric mindset is yet not there. And
Right.
when it appears here and there, is more of a lip service.
Yep.
There is a lot of talk in very nice documents supporting these ideas. So if people really follow them, they, from all perspectives, economical and ethical, something to go after. But the situation is quite different. There is a huge vendor lock-in. There is a lot of, I don't see big changes in the next few years. But there is some change that happened in the last few years. Before it was really marginal. Now people talk about it. They take it into account. They started to compare it. I saw quite a few people from the institutions going and signing the Datacentric manifesto. This is quite new, and because people became more aware of how things go, and when they fail, and they start to remember that things could have been decided otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So there is hope.
Yep.
So a question that your comments prompts to me is, there are barriers to entry out there. It's not moving as quickly as anybody who's drank the Kool-Aid and is selling Dave's books for him believes. So my question is, are there barriers to entry that you see out there that you have some insight into how to climb over them effectively within the organizations? There's all kinds of barriers, from resistance to change and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just curious if you have insight into any particular barriers that you see paired with an approach to climb over them.
Certain people are in a strong position because of their past. So when they see something like this happening, they know that they're not going to own it and manage it.
Mm-hmm.
Their power will be diminished by somebody who can do such thing. That's why they have additional resistance, even when they're intellectually convinced that might be a better approach.
Right.
And that's quite a common barrier that I see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Upton Sinclair put it well when he said it's hard to convince somebody of a new idea when their salary depends on their not understanding it.
Yeah, quite so.
Yeah. Well, incentivizing the right behavior, it's just a continuing challenge. And is there an upbeat note, Mark or Ivo, that you'd like to make on what I was thinking, Ivo, was that there's an 80-20 dynamic that we've observed in enterprise over the years, the 20% being the innovators. And so when I try to tell stories about how we've succeeded, I look to the 20%, and I find the people who are behind the success stories, and I tell those. And there's always the caveat that most organizations aren't even thinking about these things. Does that sound right to you, that we have to look to the innovators, and what else can we do to sort of move this forward in a bigger way?
There's a lot that could be done from the semantic community. I think there are huge gaps that led to all these things being still marginal. I think we should do much more to attract developers, listen to their needs, do things that is natural for them. You saw GraphQL achieve popularity in 2 years that Sparkle didn't achieve in 15, although it's much weaker language. Then we have to really collect and share successful case studies. That is super convincing when you show something. We have to make it easier for end users. And it's very important to attract people from the business. Data is way too important to be left to IT people. That's
Well said.
That's good. So that's the task ahead of us. Great conversation, everybody. Ivo, thanks for all the stimulating discussion, and thanks for taking the time. Peter, thanks for introducing us to Ivo. You're welcome anytime, sir, and we'll look forward to reading more from you and further discussions then.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Ivo, great to meet you, and your commission check is in the mail. Thank you.
You still have my address, right?
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation.
Thank you very much, Ivo. That was
you, everybody.
Really wonderful.
Yeah,
and
great
I
talk
must say, Ivo's book is really interesting. I would recommend that.
Oh, thanks. You also have the commission. Great.
Yes. Okay.
Good exchange of money this evening. Great.